He married her to protect his empire, not his heart. She promised to never love him. He promised to never care. They both broke their promises. This was never meant to be a love story. It began as a contract, a signature, a quiet agreement made behind closed doors, where power mattered more than feelings and survival mattered more than truth. From the outside, the wedding looked flawless. White flowers, polished marble, cameras carefully kept away. A powerful man standing still at the altar. A woman walking toward him with steady steps, and a heart already learning how to be quiet. No one asked why a man feared across cities would choose a bride he barely spoke to. No one asked why she agreed so easily. In their world, questions were dangerous. What people didn't see was the reason this marriage existed at all. Because this wasn't about romance. It was about protection. About lines drawn in blood and loyalty. About an empire built on silence. He was known for control. Every move measured. Every emotion locked away. He trusted no one. Not his men, not his allies, and certainly not the woman who now carried his name. And she knew the rules. Before she said, I do, no love, no expectations, no asking for more. She wasn't chosen because he wanted her. She was chosen because she was safe, or so he believed. Behind the public image of power and discipline, there were threats that never made headlines, deals that failed, enemies who smiled while counting days, a balance that could collapse with one wrong decision. This marriage was supposed to seal cracks no one else could see. In private, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Long hallways. Closed doors. Two people living under the same roof, speaking only when necessary. He gave her everything except warmth, security, guards, a name no one dared disrespect, but never affection. She accepted it with grace that surprised even her. She didn't ask for his attention, didn't challenge his distance. She learned his routine instead. The hours he never slept. The nights he stayed away. The way his voice changed when he thought no one was listening. She watched from the edges, always present, never invited in. And slowly, quietly, something began to change. Not in grand gestures, not in dramatic confessions, but in the smallest moments. A pause before he left the room. A glance held half a second too long. The way his hand tightened when danger came too close to her. He told himself it meant nothing, that this was still business. That control was intact. She told herself the same lie. Because falling in love with a man like him wasn't just foolish. It was dangerous. What neither of them understood yet was that promises made out of fear rarely survive truth. And behind the walls that kept them safe, forces were moving. Plans were unfolding without their knowledge. Eyes were watching, waiting. This marriage was meant to be armor, but armor has weight, and over time, it presses against the heart. Why did he really marry her? Why was love the one thing he refused to allow? And what happens when two people deny what's already taken root? Because some threats don't come from enemies outside. They come from what we refuse to face. And in a world where power is built on silence, love can be the most dangerous weakness of all. Before we continue, if you want more stories that make the hair on your neck stand up, go ahead and subscribe to Honey's Romance Stories. Give this video a like and share it with someone brave enough to hear the truth. Because once the bell rings, you'll never know what might be waiting for you next. The marriage without love. She learned early how to stay quiet, not because she was weak, but because listening kept her safe. She noticed things others missed. The way rooms changed when his name was spoken. The way conversations lowered themselves into whispers. The way fear dressed itself up as respect. She knew exactly who he was long before she met him. A man whose decisions decided fates. A man whose enemies disappeared without explanation. A man people described with admiration and avoided with the same breath. So when his offer came, it didn't sound like a proposal. It sounded like an ending disguised as mercy. Her family was cornered, not by lack of love, but by lack of options. Debts that grew faster than hope. Promises made by people who never intended to keep them. There were doors closing everywhere she looked. And then there was him. He didn't threaten, didn't raise his voice, didn't pretend this was anything other than what it was. A marriage for protection. A name that would shield her family. A future that would keep them alive. The cost was simple. Her freedom. Her expectations. Her heart. She accepted without drama. No tears. No negotiations. Just a quiet nod that surprised even him. Because she wasn't naive. She understood power. She understood survival. What she didn't understand yet was what it would mean to live beside a man who had built his life by feeling nothing. The wedding was efficient, elegant, emotionless. He stood still as vows were spoken, as if words had no weight. She spoke hers clearly, even though no one asked what she was giving up. When it was over, he leaned close enough for only her to hear. "This changes nothing," he said. "Do not expect affection. Do not expect loyalty beyond duty. And whatever you do, do not fall in love with me." She didn't argue. She already knew. The house became her world. Large, perfect, cold, security everywhere, privacy nowhere. She moved through it carefully, like someone walking across thin glass. She learned where not to go, what questions not to ask, which hours belonged to silence. He rarely looked at her, but when he did, it felt like being assessed, not seen. He provided everything. Clothes chosen by others. Rooms too large for one person. A life designed to keep her untouched by danger and untouched by him. They shared meals without conversation. Shared space without connection. Shared a marriage without warmth. At night, doors closed softly. Distance settled in. She lay awake, listening to the quiet, wondering how something could feel so heavy without making a sound. Inside, she was divided, grateful for safety, ashamed of relief, guilty for what her family gained because of what she surrendered. She told herself this was temporary. That endurance was easier than hope. That hearts could be taught to stay still. But the human heart doesn't obey rules for long. She began to notice him in ways she tried to stop. The tension in his shoulders when bad news arrived. The way he stood between her and danger without thinking. How his voice softened when he spoke to children and hardened again when he remembered himself. He never touched her, never crossed the lines he had drawn. And somehow, that restraint hurt more than cruelty would have. Because restraint suggested choice. She found herself waiting for sounds she pretended not to care about. Footsteps in the hallway. The click of a door late at night. Moments that never came. She loved him in silence long before she admitted it to herself. Loved him without asking, without reaching, without hope. And that was the most dangerous part. Because while she was learning how to live beside him, he was slowly becoming aware of something he had never planned for. Her presence. The way the house felt different when she wasn't in the room. The way calm followed her without effort. The way she never asked him to be anyone other than what he was. He told himself it meant nothing. That gratitude wasn't attachment. That awareness wasn't emotion. He had built his life on certainty, on control, on never needing anyone. But certainty has cracks. And behind the safety this marriage created, unseen pressures continued to move. Agreements strained. Trust shifted. The kind of danger that doesn't announce itself waited patiently. Neither of them knew it yet. This marriage, without love, was never empty. It was full of things left unsaid, full of feelings delayed, full of a truth neither was ready to face. Because sometimes the most powerful bonds don't begin with desire. They begin with endurance. Endurance, when tested, changes everything. He was a man built on rules, not the kind written down. The kind learned through loss. Discipline shaped every part of him. The way he walked into a room without hesitation. The way his voice never rose. The way silence followed him, like an order no one dared disobey. He had learned early that emotion was a liability. That attachment created openings. That love made people careless. So he removed it from his life, piece by piece. What remained was control. An empire didn't grow by accident. It grew because he never trusted instinct over strategy, never allowed feelings to guide decisions, never hesitated when action was required. Men followed him because he was fair. They feared him because he was exact. And when danger approached, he didn't react. He anticipated. Marriage to him was no different from any other decision. A solution to a problem. A shield placed where defenses were thinning. He chose her because she was quiet. Because she asked no questions. Because her presence wouldn't disturb the balance he had built so carefully. On the night they married, he made his position clear. There was no ceremony behind closed doors. No tenderness offered out of obligation. Just truth. This marriage is protection. Nothing more. His voice was steady, unemotional, final. You will have everything you need, he continued. Safety, respect, a name that keeps you untouched. Then the rule that mattered most. Do not fall in love with me. It wasn't arrogance. It was warning, because he knew what happened to people who loved him. They waited. They hoped. They became targets. He would not allow that. She listened without interruption. No protest. No disappointment shown. That calm unsettled him more than anger would have. Most people reacted to him. She absorbed him. He saw strength there, the dangerous kind that didn't announce itself. So he reinforced the distance. He stayed away when possible, kept conversations brief. Let walls do what walls were meant to do. Control demanded consistency. Yet even discipline has limits. He began noticing changes he couldn't account for. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Not empty, just still. She brought order without intrusion, peace without demand. She never followed him, never questioned his absences, never asked why some nights stretched into mornings without explanation. And that unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. He was used to resistance, used to defiance, not acceptance. When danger circled closer, he tightened security around her first. Not because of feeling, that's what he told himself, but because she represented risk, a threat to stability. Yet his reactions betrayed him. He positioned himself between her and raised voices. He noticed when she stopped eating. He registered fear in her eyes before she spoke. He didn't touch her, didn't cross the boundaries he set. But restraint is still a form of attention. Late at night, when meetings ended and the house settled, he found himself listening for sounds that had nothing to do with threats. Her footsteps, a door closing softly, a presence that grounded the space around him. He told himself it was habit, that routines created comfort. But comfort was something he had never allowed himself to need. She, meanwhile, learned him in fragments. The way he stood still when thinking, the rare moments his guard slipped around people he trusted, the weight he carried without complaint. She saw the man beneath the control, and she loved him anyway, quietly, carefully, without hope of return. That was the unspoken agreement between them. He would never ask for her heart. She would never offer it. But love doesn't require permission. And the more he tried to keep his distance, the clearer it became that distance was no longer protecting him. Because control works only until something matters. And without realizing it, she already did. Living with a stranger, they lived in the same house, but not in the same world. By day, he commanded men who would follow him without question. Decisions were made in quiet rooms. Fates were decided with a nod. Names were erased without ceremony. His voice moved systems. His presence shifted power. And while he ruled an empire built on loyalty and fear, she moved through his mansion like a shadow that belonged to no one. Soft footsteps, lowered eyes, hands folded in patience. She learned the rhythms of the house before she learned his moods. Which halls stayed guarded, which rooms were never entered, which hours belonged to silence. They crossed paths like strangers, passing in corridors, sharing space without contact, existing in parallel lives that never quite touched. They rarely spoke. When they did, the words were practical. Security is changing. You'll stay inside tonight. The East Wing is restricted. No warmth, no questions, no curiosity, just information. Sometimes they sat across from each other at the long dining table, plates untouched, candles burning low, silence doing all the talking. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. She learned not to reach for him, not with her hands, not with her voice, not even with her eyes. He learned not to look at her for too long, because when he did, something in his control shifted. They never fought, never argued, never confronted. Conflict requires closeness. They had distance, the kind that keeps people safe and lonely at the same time. At night, the house separated them. 2 doors, 2 worlds, 2 people carrying thoughts they refused to speak. She would sit on the edge of her bed, listening to the sounds of a life she was now part of, but never invited into. Phones ringing in distant rooms, voices behind closed doors, footsteps that passed her door and never stopped. She wondered what it would feel like to be chosen instead of assigned. He, in his own silence, felt something unfamiliar. Stillness, not peace, not calm, absence. The house felt different with her in it. Not louder, not warmer, just different. As if a presence existed that didn't demand anything, but still changed everything. Sometimes he caught himself noticing small things. The way she moved carefully, like she didn't want to disturb the air. The way she never took up space that wasn't offered. The way she carried herself with quiet dignity, even when fear lived behind her eyes. It unsettled him, not because she was weak, but because she was strong without force. That kind of strength didn't obey hierarchy. It didn't respond to power. It didn't bow. And that made it dangerous. He told himself this marriage was controlled, contained, defined. Yet control began slipping in ways he couldn't quantify. Not in his empire, not in his authority, in his attention. He noticed when she skipped meals, when her voice sounded thinner than usual, when the house felt quieter than it should have. He told himself it was awareness, responsibility, not concern. She, meanwhile, learned to love him without contact, without words, without hope, in observation, in patience, in restraint. She memorized the shape of his presence from a distance, the weight of his silence, the gravity of his control. She loved a man who had never invited love into his life. And that was the tension. Not anger, not conflict, restraint. Two people sharing space, sharing a name, sharing a life on paper, but not sharing a heart. Yet, because tension doesn't need touch, it doesn't need confession. It only needs closeness and denial. And they had both, in abundance. This wasn't a marriage built on affection. It was built on distance, on structure, on rules. But rules are only strong until something begins to matter. And slowly, quietly, without permission, something already did. He protected her without warmth. That was his version of care. Extra guards posted outside her door. Routes changed before she ever knew there was danger. Names removed from circulation when they asked too many questions about her. He never explained, never reassured, never softened his voice. Protection, to him, didn't require tenderness. It required results. She noticed. She noticed how security doubled when threats increased, even when no one told her why. She noticed how his meetings ended early on nights she seemed unsettled. She noticed how his body shifted, almost imperceptibly, whenever someone stood too close to her. He never acknowledged it, but she did. She learned his habits long before he learned her presence. The hour he drank his coffee untouched. The nights he stood by the window instead of sleeping. The way his jaw tightened when lies were spoken in his presence. She could sense him before he entered a room. A change in the air, a stillness that followed. He, meanwhile, treated her like part of the architecture, always there, unmoving, reliable. Until one day, she wasn't. She stayed in her room longer than usual, skipped a meal, let silence answer questions no one asked aloud. And he noticed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to pause mid-conversation. Enough to glance down the hallway that led to her rooms. Enough to register absence where he'd grown used to quiet presence. He told himself it was routine. That awareness was responsibility. But responsibility doesn't linger. She waited without expecting anything. That was her quiet strength. She didn't wait for affection. Didn't wait for promises. Didn't wait for change. She waited because waiting was safer than hoping. She accepted that love for her would exist in silence, in observation, in restraint. She cared in the smallest ways, ensuring the house was calm when he returned, leaving lights on where darkness weighed heavier, remembering things no one asked her to remember. She never crossed the line, never asked for his attention, never demanded acknowledgement. And somehow, that absence of demand began to undo him. He started noticing details he shouldn't. The way she paused before speaking as if measuring the cost of words. The way her eyes softened when she thought she was alone. The strength it took to remain composed in a world that treated her as collateral. He noticed her hands. How they trembled once briefly when danger came too close. how they steadied themselves without help. He noticed her silence wasn't emptiness. It was restraint. And restraint, he knew, was expensive. That realization unsettled him because he understood cost. He had paid it his entire life. He began finding reasons to be in the same rooms, not to speak, just to confirm presence. He lingered longer than necessary, listened more than he needed to. She noticed that too, but she didn't acknowledge it, because acknowledging it would mean hoping, and hope had no place here. Yet something was changing, not in words, not in touch, in awareness. They existed closer now, not physically, emotionally. The silence between them shifted. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged with things unspoken. With care, neither admitted. With questions, neither dared ask. And somewhere in that quiet tension, a truth began to surface. Love doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it waits, observes, grows where it isn't welcome. The question was no longer whether something was forming. It was whether it was allowed to survive. Can love grow where it's not allowed? Neither of them had an answer yet, but both were beginning to fear the same thing, that the rules they lived by were no longer enough to contain what was already there. Growing connection without romance. The connection didn't announce itself. It didn't demand attention. It existed in moments no one else noticed. In public, he defended her without hesitation. A careless remark was corrected before it finished forming. A look held too long was enough for him to step closer. A question asked out of place was met with silence sharp enough to end curiosity. No explanations followed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't offer reassurance. He simply made it clear, without words, that she was not to be challenged. And then, in private, he returned to distance. No conversation afterward. No acknowledgement of what he had done. No sign that the defense meant anything beyond obligation. That contrast confused her more than cruelty ever could. Because cruelty is honest. Distance pretends nothing happened. She watched him stand up for her in rooms filled with power, only to pass her in the hallway later as if they had never stood side by side. She never confronted him. Instead, she turned inward. She became a quiet presence for everyone else. When staff were shaken by violence they weren't allowed to speak about, she listened. When fear crept into voices late at night, she softened the space around it. When tension filled the house, she carried calm without asking credit. She comforted others, while learning how to hide her own loneliness. She smiled when spoken to, nodded when instructions were given, moved through the days with a grace that required effort no one saw. At night, when the house settled and guards shifted positions, something changed. The late nights began without planning. She would be in the common room, reading without focus. He would pass through, intending to leave again, and then he wouldn't. He would sit across the room, not beside her, never beside her. No conversation followed, just presence, the ticking of a clock, the distant hum of security systems. Two people occupying the same silence without expectation. Those nights became frequent. Neither acknowledged them. She never looked up first. He never asked why she stayed. But something in those shared hours mattered. He noticed how her breathing slowed as the night deepened, how she stayed awake long past exhaustion, as if sleep was easier when someone else was near. She noticed how his shoulders lowered in those moments, how the tension he carried everywhere loosened just enough to rest. No words passed between them, and yet something was being said. That silence wasn't empty. It was shared. That mattered more than either of them understood. He told himself it was coincidence, that routine created overlap. That stillness didn't mean connection. But men who live by control notice when control changes shape. And his was changing. He began to measure time by her presence, not consciously, instinctively. He stayed later than planned, delayed departures without reason, listened for footsteps he pretended not to expect. She noticed but refused to name it, because naming it would give it power. And power, in this house, always came at a cost. Still, the connection grew, not through confession, not through touch, through consistency, through quiet nights, through protection without tenderness, through care without claim. They were building something neither had permission to want, a bond formed without language, without promises, without safety. And in a world governed by rules, this was the most dangerous thing of all, because connection doesn't need romance to be real. It only needs time, attention, and two people willing to remain where they could easily walk away. Neither of them did. Not yet. It began with almost speaking, almost reaching, almost believing. Their connection lived in what never crossed the line, in looks that lasted a breath too long, in pauses that carried meaning no one named, in the way silence started to feel intentional. Everything between them was unspoken, and that made it powerful. She waited, not the dramatic kind of waiting, not counting days or demanding change, the quiet kind, the kind that sits patiently in the background of the heart, telling itself not to ask for more while secretly wondering what more might feel like. She waited for nothing, she told herself. And yet, she noticed everything. She noticed when he lingered at the edge of rooms, when his voice softened just enough when speaking to her, when his presence arrived before his footsteps. That quiet care grew familiar. It showed up in details no one else would recognize. A glass of water placed near her without comment. A meeting cut short when tension rose too high in the house. A guard reassigned before she ever felt afraid. He never said it was for her. She never asked. That was their language. But something shifted. Waiting, when prolonged, begins to change shape. It starts to imagine. She caught herself hoping, not for declarations, not for affection, just acknowledgement, a look that stayed, a word spoken without purpose, a moment where distance eased instead of tightened. Hope crept in quietly, the way it always does, and hope is dangerous because hope asks questions, and questions demand answers. He sensed it before she did. Men like him survived by recognizing patterns before they became threats. And hope was a threat. He saw it in her eyes. Not expectation, but possibility. The idea that something could exist beyond the rules he had drawn. That realization startled him, because hope had no place here. Hope made people careless. Hope made people visible. Hope made people break. So he did what he always did when control was challenged. He pulled away. Not suddenly, not obviously. In increments. He shortened conversations, ended shared nights earlier, let silence stretch wider than before. He returned to distance like armor. She felt it immediately, not as rejection, as absence. The space where presence had been. She told herself, she imagined it, that nothing had changed, that waiting meant accepting whatever shape things took. But the heart knows when something retreats. Her hope didn't disappear. It just learned how to hide. She began guarding herself the way he always had. Fewer glances, less stillness, More emotional distance, disguised as composure. Two people retreating for opposite reasons. She retreated to protect her heart. He retreated to protect his control. And neither said a word. The unspoken stretched between them. Heavier now. What once felt like quiet care began to feel like restraint. He told himself this was necessary. That rules existed for survival. That allowing hope would undo everything he had built. She told herself this was expected. That waiting didn't guarantee arrival. That loving in silence meant accepting loss without protest. This was the danger point. Hope versus self-protection. Because hope asks for courage, and self-protection asks for retreat. And when both exist in the same space, something has to break. They stood at the edge of something fragile. Not love yet, but the possibility of it. And possibility, once noticed, cannot be unseen. The question was no longer whether something existed between them. It was whether either of them would survive choosing it. The misunderstanding didn't arrive loudly. It slipped in quietly, the way truth sometimes does when it isn't meant to be heard. She wasn't listening. She never listened. She was only passing through the corridor, moving the way she always did, carefully, unnoticed, when voices carried farther than they were supposed to. His voice was calm, measured, the voice he used when decisions were already made. The arrangement won't be permanent, he said. She slowed, without realizing it. Once the situation stabilizes, he continued, the marriage ends. She was never meant to stay. There was a pause, a low murmur in response. She couldn't hear clearly. Then the word that sealed everything. Temporary. He said it without cruelty, without hesitation, as if it were obvious, as if it had always been true. She didn't wait to hear more. She didn't need to, because some words don't require explanation. Temporary, not chosen, not kept, not meant to last. She walked away before her presence could be noticed, her steps steady even as something inside her cracked open quietly. It wasn't anger she felt. It was clarity. All the moments she had almost believed in rearranged themselves instantly. The late nights, the protection, the silence that had felt shared. She saw it all differently now. Not connection, containment, not care, convenience. Her heart had filled in spaces that were never offered to her, and that realization hurt more than rejection ever could. She returned to her room and closed the door gently, as if noise might expose what she was feeling. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the truth settle. She was never meant to stay. She had mistaken proximity for attachment, silence for understanding, restraint for feeling. Her love, quiet, careful, restrained, had grown in a space where it was never invited. And now she understood. Her feelings weren't shared. They weren't returned. They weren't even acknowledged. They were a mistake. Not dramatic, not reckless, just misplaced. She didn't cry. Crying would have meant surprise. Instead, she felt something colder. Acceptance. The kind that arrives when hope finally runs out of places to hide. From that moment on, she changed. Not visibly, not suddenly, but completely. She stopped waiting, stopped lingering in shared spaces, stopped reading late into the night where he might appear, stopped offering quiet care that went unnoticed. She became efficient, contained, distant. She began preparing for an ending no one had officially announced. Meanwhile, he noticed the shift without understanding it. The house felt different again, quieter, sharper. She was still there, but something essential had withdrawn. He noticed she no longer stayed in common rooms. that shared nights ended before they began, that her presence no longer anchored the silence. He told himself it was better this way. That distance restored order. But order felt empty now. He didn't know what she had heard, didn't know which words had reached her. He only knew that something he hadn't planned to lose was suddenly gone. And for the first time since this marriage began, he felt the cost of control. Because protection without warmth can still hurt, and silence, once misunderstood, becomes a wall. She had finally understood her place. Temporary. And once that truth takes root, love has only two choices: disappear quietly, or break something on its way out. Major conflict, the misunderstanding. What she didn't know was that he never intended to hurt her. Every step he had taken, every measured word, every distance he kept was meant as protection. He had seen too much, lived too much, felt too much for anyone else to survive beside him without cost. He believed that by keeping her at arm's length, by enforcing silence, by forbidding attachment, he was keeping her alive, even from himself. "I cannot allow this," he whispered to no one. The night he noticed her pause mid-step in the hall, almost as if she had been waiting for him. Almost. She would have noticed if he had looked up. But he didn't. He kept walking, because care had to be quiet. And he could not risk that quiet being interpreted as love. Yet, as she overheard that single word, temporary, her world shifted instantly, and the emotional fallout was immediate. She withdrew, slowly at first, imperceptibly, like a tide pulling out to sea. She stopped lingering near him, stopped glancing toward him in shared spaces, stopped placing herself where she might be noticed. She moved with efficiency now, masking the storm inside with composed gestures and careful steps. Even in the presence of others, she seemed untouched. Yet every movement carried a weight only she could feel. And he noticed. Not immediately, not at first. But absence cannot be ignored forever. Rooms felt emptier, corridors longer. The nights stretched and stretched without the faint echo of her presence. Even the guards noticed her absence in small ways. Pauses in conversation, meals eaten alone, quiet footsteps no longer trailing his. He felt it. He sensed the shift. Yet, he did not understand it. Because he saw only obedience, discipline, restraint, not heartbreak, not disappointment, not the grief of a heart quietly broken in silence. And that is the cruelest kind of distance. When someone is gone in the ways that matter most, yet their presence remains visible. He walked past her room at midnight. She was sitting there, still and composed, hands folded in her lap. He stopped for a moment. A faint echo of concern reached him. Then he told himself she was fine. She always was. But fine is fragile. And absence whispers louder than presence ever could. He did not realize what he was losing. Or perhaps he could not. He had trained himself to ignore attachment, to dismiss affection, to assume that the people who mattered would wait for him, because they had no choice. But she was different. She had always been different. And now, as the silence thickened, as shared moments dwindled into rare glances, he began to feel it. The gravity of her withdrawal, the emptiness her quiet care had once filled. The truth that she was not just a presence in his house, she had become part of its pulse. And without her, the walls seemed higher, the rooms darker, the nights endless. Yet he still did not understand. He assumed she would remain patient, assumed she would endure, assumed protection was worth the cost of her absence. But the mind and heart, he was learning, do not always obey assumptions. And the question began to haunt him. in quiet moments. Will he realize what he's losing before it's too late? Because love denied is not love destroyed. It waits, and absence sharpens its edge. The danger, the real danger, wasn't outside the walls of his empire. It was within them. The cost of his rules, the price of his silence, and the truth that sometimes keeping someone safe means pushing them toward the one thing he feared most, leaving. The silence, most dangerous phase. The house grew colder, not in temperature, not because the walls had changed, but because silence has weight, and weight bends everything around it. There were no shared meals anymore. He ate alone. She ate alone. Even when the table was long enough for them both, no one joined the other. No words were exchanged. No glances lingered. The only sound was the faint scrape of silverware, punctuating emptiness. No late nights. The nights they had once spent together in quiet presence, sitting in the shadows of the house, simply being near one another, vanished. Now, she remained in her room until the hours slipped past midnight, and he retreated to his chambers before she could notice him. Shared spaces became off-limits. Conversations were stripped of warmth, reduced to instructions and necessities. No waiting. The almost hope that had once flickered in her chest dimmed, smothered by distance. She no longer lingered in hallways, waiting for him to pass. She no longer imagined quiet moments where their proximity might mean something more. She stopped anticipating, stopped hoping. But the heart remembers. Her inner conflict became a storm she carried silently. Loving him hurt. Hurts in ways she hadn't realized before. Hurts because she knew he had a heart too heavy to be shared. Hurts because she was drawn to him in spite of danger, in spite of rules, in spite of everything telling her she shouldn't. Hurts because each unspoken glance, each fleeting almost touch, reminded her of what she might never have. And leaving would be simpler. It would rid her of tension, of quiet longing, of nights spent listening for a presence that no longer lingered. It would allow her to protect herself fully. But leaving wasn't the choice she could make, because staying, even in silence, even in restraint, was consuming her in a different way. Staying meant losing herself. Her identity, once quiet but intact, was slowly dissolving into the margins of a life designed around another. Every measured step she took in the house, every observation she recorded silently, every moment she bent herself to accommodate his world chipped away at the woman she had once been. And yet, she couldn't leave. Her heart betrayed her, even when her mind screamed caution. Every moment without him felt sharper than his absence. Every shadow in the halls a reminder that she had given herself to someone who had refused to receive her. He didn't understand this. He thought distance would protect her. He thought silence would shield both of them. He thought control could contain the chaos that was already unfolding in the spaces between them. But love cannot be silenced. Not when it lives in every careful step, every restrained breath, every quiet observation. And so, the silence became the most dangerous phase. Because in that quiet, nothing was said, and everything was happening. Every missed glance, every meal eaten alone, every footstep in a corridor without acknowledgement became a conversation neither of them could voice. She wrestled with hope she couldn't trust, love she couldn't claim, and the suffocating knowledge that staying would cost her everything she had left. And he felt the absence. He noticed the spaces she no longer occupied, the nights that ended with her behind closed doors, the quiet that had once felt peaceful, now pressed against him, unfamiliar and unbearable. But he didn't understand why, didn't recognize what was slipping from him, didn't yet know that the walls built to protect had started to imprison both of them in separate worlds within the same house. And in that silence, in that distance, the danger wasn't outside. It was inside. Inside, the unspoken. Inside, the restraint. Inside the quiet, aching hearts that could no longer reach each other without breaking the rules they had both been forced to live by. This was the point of reckoning they hadn't yet realized was coming, where patience and endurance would be tested, where love, denied, would begin to demand its own way, because in silence, the heart never stops speaking, and theirs had been speaking all along. He noticed it first in the rooms, not because they had changed, not because the walls were colder, but because her absence, the subtle absence of her presence, left a hollow he hadn't anticipated. The corridors that had once been alive with soft, careful footsteps now echoed emptily. The common rooms, once dimly warmed by her quiet care, felt vacant. Even the furniture seemed distant, as though the air itself had shifted. The house, the empire, the meticulously controlled world he had built, was missing something essential. He tried to dismiss it, told himself it was habit, that his mind was inventing need where none existed. But control, he discovered, is fragile. Orders began slipping through the cracks. Meetings extended too long because his mind wandered to empty rooms. Security alerts were noticed later than usual. Details he would have caught instinctively were overlooked. Small mistakes, small lapses. Control was unraveling. And with it, he realized something he hadn't admitted, not to anyone, not even to himself. The house felt empty because she wasn't filling it. Not physically, not even emotionally, at first glance. But her absence carried weight heavier than any guard's presence or any fortress he had built. It wasn't her voice he missed. It was the life she quietly infused into the space. The subtle energy that made rooms feel safe, grounded, alive. The quiet care that required no words. He began to notice everything. Her routines, the way she arranged her space without making it her own. The way she moved through corridors as if she belonged everywhere. But to him, the way her presence, restrained though it was, had anchored the house, and now without it, the foundation trembled. It unsettled him more than any danger ever had. For the first time in years, he felt the vulnerability of absence, the vulnerability of emotion unacknowledged, the vulnerability of something precious slipping through his grasp without permission. And slowly, painfully, he realized what he had been doing all along. He had been protecting her from danger, yes, but he had also been protecting himself from attachment, from loss, from love. And now, the cost of that protection was staring back at him in empty halls, in meals eaten alone, in the silence of nights that once held shared space, in the subtle, devastating absence of someone who had always mattered more than he admitted. He wanted to call her, to speak, to bridge the distance. But rules, habits, and fear held him back. He reminded himself that control was necessary. That attachment was a liability. That love was dangerous. Yet each passing day made him question whether control had ever really mattered. Because the house had never felt so empty. And the emptiness wasn't just the absence of her presence. It was the absence of what he had failed to recognize. Every detail he had overlooked. Every quiet moment he had dismissed. Every almost glance he had denied himself. All of it was gone now. And in that emptiness, he began to understand what he had ignored, what he had taken for granted, was not replaceable. Not by orders, not by power, not by fear. And the worst part, he didn't know if he had time to reclaim it. Because when silence and absence dominate, hearts grow distant. And distance is sometimes impossible to close once it's measured in months, not moments. At this point, the viewer feels it too. The gravity of what is at stake. The tension between duty and desire. The pull of love restrained versus the ache of its denial. We watch him falter, notice, hesitate. We feel the house through his eyes. empty, cold, incomplete. And we know, even if he doesn't yet, that losing her would mean losing not just a companion, but a part of himself he didn't know existed. And so the stage is set for confrontation, for revelation, for a reckoning that neither of them can escape. Because silence is no longer neutral. It has become dangerous. And hearts, when tested by absence, rarely remain patient forever. The turning point. The turning point arrived quietly, the way most life-changing moments do. It wasn't announced with shouting. It wasn't heralded by dramatic gestures. It came in a heartbeat, a single moment, and it changed everything. She was walking through the estate late one evening, the corridors dimly lit, when a shadow moved where it shouldn't have. A mistake. A misstep. A threat she hadn't anticipated. Her heart raced, not from danger outside, but from something closer. Something she had feared in silence for months. Him. She had lived with this quiet, restrained man for months now. She had tolerated his absence, his rules, his cold efficiency. She had trained herself to survive in the spaces he occupied, and the spaces he left empty. But tonight, the tension of all those months condensed into a single, sharp, undeniable truth. She could no longer exist in the house as it was. Not safely, not whole, not emotionally intact. And for the first time, she acted with deliberate intent. She prepared herself. Quietly. Documents neatly folded. A pen laid beside them. A plan mapped for leaving. Not fighting, not hoping, not waiting. It was her silent declaration. Her moment of agency. When he found her there, papers in hand, he froze. He saw her fear. Not the fear of enemies, not the fear of danger, but the fear of him. Not of what he could do, but of what staying meant. Of what being close to him, within his world, had cost her. And then, like a spark in the darkness, it hit him. He hadn't just protected her. He hadn't just enforced rules. He hadn't merely kept her safe in the ways he understood. He depended on her. Her presence anchored more than the house. It anchored him. Her quiet care, her stillness, her restraint. These were not inconveniences. They were lifelines. He realized that the emptiness he had felt, the control that had begun to slip, the subtle unease he had ignored, all of it existed because she mattered. More than rules, more than control, more than the empire he had spent his life building. He had trained himself to survive alone, to hold emotion at bay, to shield his heart. But no rules could shield him from what was already happening. And now, seeing her fear, seeing the courage it took to quietly plan her exit, he understood the truth he had been avoiding. He had underestimated the weight of absence. He had underestimated what it meant to have her in his world. He had underestimated himself. For the first time, he spoke. His voice low, deliberate, stripped of the usual control. "You were never temporary," he said, more to himself than to her. The words trembled in the air between them, heavy with realization, the kind of words that cannot be unsaid, the kind of truth that has waited, patient, for recognition. Her hands tightened on the papers. She met his gaze for the first time in weeks, without retreating. The fear was still there, but it was layered now with something else, something unspoken. Hope. He stepped closer. Not demanding, not assuming, not claiming. He simply stepped into the space he had kept sacred, controlled, distant. And in that step, the first barrier began to crumble. He had built walls to protect, but walls cannot hold what already belongs to the heart. And now, for the first time, he realized keeping her safe was no longer about distance. It was about presence. It was about acknowledgement. It was about allowing himself to need her as much as she had been silently enduring him. For the first time, Both of them stood on the same precipice, not separated by silence, not separated by rules, but standing face to face with the truth they had been too afraid to admit. They needed each other. Not as convenience, not as duty, not as protection, but as the only thing in their world that could make it feel alive. And in that quiet, fragile realization, everything changed. The empire, the house, the rules, all of it became secondary, because hearts, once recognized, will not wait quietly forever, and neither would theirs. It was in that quiet moment, the one no one else would have seen, that he finally understood. The papers lay on the table, neatly folded, ready for her to take them away from him forever. And he saw it. Her fear, not of danger, not of enemies lurking in shadows, not of the life he had built or the violence that surrounded it. Her fear was of him, not of what he could do, but of what she had already given him without asking, of the quiet hope that had grown inside her heart, unspoken and almost invisible, of the fragile love that had waited patiently in silence, only to feel the weight of his distance crushing it. And in that realization, something inside him shifted. He hadn't been protecting her alone. He hadn't been simply keeping her safe from outside threats. He had been depending on her. Her presence had anchored him, steadied him, softened him in ways he hadn't admitted even to himself. Her quiet care had become the pulse of a life he thought he could live without intimacy, without softness, without connection. He had relied on her strength, her patience, her observation, without naming it, without recognizing it. And now, seeing her ready to leave, he felt powerless. For the first time, he saw the truth he had denied. He thought love made people weak, until losing her made him powerless. All the rules, all the control, all the walls he had built, none of it mattered anymore. They had never mattered. The realization hit him deeper than any threat ever could, stronger than any enemy's attack, more urgent than the call of any empire. He took a step toward her, a step without orders, a step without expectation, a step that was purely instinct, purely heart. And she looked at him, still holding the papers, still trembling, not from fear of danger, but from fear of losing herself, from fear of losing him, from fear that their unspoken bond had already cost too much. He reached out, not to command, not to protect, but to acknowledge that he needed her, that the world he had built around himself could not function without her presence, that he was weaker than he admitted because her absence had already started to break him. His voice was low, almost a whisper, carrying the weight of months of restraint. You were never temporary. No arguments, no explanations, just truth. And in her eyes, he saw the almost forgotten spark of hope ignite again. Not bold, not loud, but steady, fragile, persistent. For the first time, the quiet tension between them dissolved into recognition. They were not strangers. They were not companions by chance. They were entwined by circumstance and by something far more powerful than rules, fear, or silence. And in that moment, he realized the full depth of what he had been feeling all along. He had loved her, without admitting it, without allowing it, without understanding it. And now, facing the possibility of losing her, he understood the cost of his pride, his control, his fear. He thought love made people weak, until losing her made him powerless. And powerless, he would never remain if it meant losing her. Because some truths cannot wait to be spoken. Some hearts cannot remain hidden. And some love, once acknowledged, refuses to be denied. The confession, not physical, emotional. He spoke first in a voice that was almost foreign to her. Not commanding, not controlled, not measured, but raw, trembling at the edges. He began, pausing, as if he had forgotten how to string words together. I've spent my life building walls. Walls to keep people out. Walls to keep myself safe. His eyes didn't leave the floor. They didn't rise to meet hers. Attachment. Connection. It terrifies me. More than danger. More than death. More than losing control. She listened quietly, not leaning forward, not offering reassurance, just letting the words reach her, carrying weight that had been unspoken for months. I've lost people I shouldn't have. People I trusted too quickly. People I thought I could protect, and failed. He swallowed hard. His jaw tightened. The thought of loving someone, of letting someone in, of depending on someone, it's terrifying. I thought if I kept you at a distance, I could keep you safe. I thought I could keep myself safe. I thought that was the only way to survive. He lifted his eyes finally, meeting hers with honesty she had never seen. I didn't forbid myself from loving you because I didn't want to. I forbade it because I was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean if I let go. Afraid of how powerless I would feel. If I needed someone like I need you. She remained calm. No tears. No exclamations. Just steady, attentive presence. The same quiet grace that had captivated him from the start. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost measured, but firm. I know. He blinked. What? That you've been protecting yourself. As much as you've been protecting me. I've seen it in the distance. The silence. The rules you impose. I've understood that love, in your world, isn't simple. And I've understood that love, in your world, can be terrifying. Her gaze held his, without pleading, without desperation. I loved you, quietly, she said. I still do. But I won't beg. I won't step into danger for hope alone. I won't stay in a house of silence, just because it's familiar. I won't give myself to someone unwilling to meet me halfway. Her honesty was steady, balanced, measured, and it struck him harder than any confession he could have made himself. She had loved him in silence, without expectation, without demand, a love he had been too afraid to accept. And now, she had offered him a choice, not to beg for it, not to beg for her, but to earn it. The air between them was still, heavy with months of restraint, heavy with confessions, unspoken feelings, and fear finally named. He realized then that love had never been forbidden. It had been terrifying, because to love her meant exposing himself, exposing vulnerability, exposing a part of him he had trained for years to keep hidden. And yet, he wanted it, more than he had ever wanted anything else in his controlled, ordered life. He wanted her presence, her quiet care, her attention given freely, without demand or expectation. He wanted to be powerless with her. And for the first time, he realized that the rules, the walls, the distance, they had been unnecessary. Not because love is easy, not because fear disappears overnight, but because love, once acknowledged, will find a way past even the most fortified heart. And in that quiet, tense, fragile room, two truths aligned. He feared attachment, and he could no longer imagine life without it. She had loved quietly, and she would continue to love, but only if he was willing to meet her fully. The confessions hung between them, unspoken, but understood. Not a single touch, not a single word of physical longing, just honesty. And in that honesty, the first real moment of connection, the first surrender to emotion, took root. A love built on restraint, and fear had finally found its voice. But the question remained, would he step into it or retreat once more? Because love is never truly proven in words alone. It is proven in courage. And he had just begun to realize how much courage it would take. She sat across from him, composed as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes steady, but not soft. Calm. Her presence was quiet, but it carried the weight of months of endurance, months of hope restrained, and months of unspoken love. She had waited. She had observed. She had learned the edges of his world without ever crossing them. And now, when he had finally admitted his fear, his hesitation, his vulnerability, she responded not with desperation, not with pleading, but with honesty. "I loved you quietly," she said, her voice measured, almost serene. "I still do. I have loved you in silence, because that was the only way I could. I will not beg. I will not demand. I will not throw myself into a life that endangers me emotionally, just because you are finally ready to admit what you feel." Her words struck him harder than any fight, any confrontation, any near miss with danger ever had. She loved him, fully, truly, but she loved herself enough to set boundaries. She loved him enough to demand sincerity. She loved him enough to leave if he couldn't meet her halfway. And the tension in the room thickened. Will she stay? Or is it too late? He realized then that this moment, this fragile, tense, fragile alive moment, wasn't just about confessions or admission. It was about choice. Because love, he now understood, cannot be claimed through fear or control. It cannot be forced. It must be met with courage. And he saw, in her calm honesty, that she was no longer waiting for him to act out of habit. She was waiting to act for herself. Every second he hesitated, he felt the distance widen again. Every pause reminded him that she had been giving quietly for months, without recognition, without demand, and he had nearly lost it all by remaining afraid. He saw it clearly for the first time. Her love was patient, restrained, and constant, but it had limits, and those limits were not negotiable. He wanted to reach across the table, to erase months of silence with a single motion, but he stopped himself. Because she wasn't waiting for grand gestures. She was waiting for truth. The air between them seemed to hum with the weight of possibility. If he failed, it would end here. No second chances. No words left unspoken. If he succeeded, it would not be easy. Fear would still exist. Walls would still need to fall. Trust would have to be rebuilt. And yet, he understood something essential. He didn't just want her to stay. He needed her to stay. Not as a possession. Not as a guard behind walls of control. Not as someone who tolerated his silence. But as a partner in the quiet, dangerous, fragile life they were beginning to imagine together. And the tension was unbearable. Because he knew, as she knew, that choice rested on him. That courage now mattered more than pride. That action mattered more than words. Would he rise to meet her honesty? Or would he retreat again into fear? The room felt impossibly still. And in that stillness, the unspoken truth pressed down on them both. They could either surrender to fear, or finally allow the love that had been growing in silence to take its rightful place. And neither knew how the next moment would be decided. Because the hardest part of love is waiting for the other person to meet you. When you have already given your all. The payoff. The days that followed were quiet, but they were no longer empty. The house seemed smaller, more intimate, somehow sharper in its clarity, no longer weighed by unspoken fears or misinterpreted intentions. The silence remained, but it was different now. Charged, tense, and alive with possibility. She moved through the corridors, as she always had. Graceful, quiet, measured, but now with purpose. Every step was hers. Every choice intentional. And he noticed, not as a ruler observing a subordinate, not as a protector marking territory, but as a man recognizing the irreplaceable force that had been in his life all along. She had not begged. She had not demanded. She had simply chosen herself. Even as she stood beside him, navigating a house filled with shadows and control. That choice was the ultimate confession. It was the proof that love is not possession, that control cannot bind the heart, that silence, when allowed to fester, can destroy what even violence never could. They began to exist in the house differently, not touching yet, not declaring, not rushing toward a fantasy of perfect romance, but noticing. He noticed the small ways she claimed space, the careful way she offered attention, the subtle, almost imperceptible acts of care that spoke louder than words. She noticed the small cracks in his armor, the hesitation in his steps, the moments when his hand lingered near her, but never touched, the rare vulnerability in his eyes, now visible because he knew she would see it without judgment. And in those quiet observations, a fragile rhythm emerged. They spoke less of love, more of life. Shared spaces returned slowly, deliberately. Meals were taken in each other's presence, but not rushed. Nights were spent in careful proximity, feeling rather than claiming, because love had changed. It was no longer an inevitability. It was a choice, and the truth became undeniable. Love is not possession. Love is choice. Each glance, each gesture, each word of acknowledgement was earned. Each step forward required courage. Each moment together demanded attention, honesty, and respect. They were learning how to exist together in a world where silence had once suffocated them, where distance had nearly broken them, where fear had kept their hearts in chains. She stayed, yes, but on her own terms. And he, for the first time in his life, had no choice but to meet her in full, to accept the power of her presence, to embrace the vulnerability he had spent a lifetime avoiding. It was bittersweet, not fairy tale. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic resolutions, no sudden transformation of the man who had feared attachment more than life itself. Instead, there was recognition. There was balance. There was quiet care met with intentional presence. She had not needed him to save her. He had not needed her to complete him. They had needed each other to awaken the parts of themselves that had been silent for too long. And in that awakening, the emotional truth became clear. Love cannot be forced. Silence cannot be ignored. Fear cannot protect what the heart wants. Some walls must fall. Some fears must be faced. Some truths must finally be spoken. And in that space, fragile but alive, they discovered a love that was not easy, not perfect, but real. Bittersweet, dangerous, honest. The house was no longer empty. The silence no longer threatening. And the two hearts, once separated by fear and misunderstanding, finally beat in awareness of each other. Careful, deliberate, and free. Love had been chosen. And that choice was everything. Because in the end, love is never given. It is never taken. It is always and only chosen. And in the quiet aftermath of all that silence, all that restraint, all that fear, he realized something deeper than words could capture. It wasn't that she had taught him to love. No, she hadn't handed him a map. She hadn't offered a manual. She hadn't begged him to change or guided him step by step toward affection. She had done something far more powerful. She had taught him how to feel. Through months of quiet observation, through patience tempered by strength, through honesty delivered without demand, she had broken through walls he didn't even know existed. He felt the weight of her presence in the house, long before he acknowledged it. He felt the subtle kindnesses she offered to the world, and to him, indirectly, even when he refused to notice. He felt the moments where she cared without expectation, where she protected herself but allowed him into her space just enough to matter. And he began to feel, not just responsibility, not just obligation, not just power or control, but tenderness. Fear, yes, but tempered by courage. Attachment, yes, but tempered by awareness. Vulnerability, yes, but softened by the knowledge that she would meet it with honesty, not judgment, not weakness. He felt for the first time what it was like to be human inside the rigid armor of a man who had thought himself untouchable. He felt the absence she created when she almost left. He felt the cost of his pride and the danger of his silence. He felt the sharp edge of longing and the steady warmth of recognition. She hadn't taught him how to love her, because love is never a lesson to be delivered. She had taught him how to feel, and feeling is far more difficult than loving, because to feel is to open yourself to risk. To feel is to confront vulnerability. To feel is to see yourself in someone else's quiet honesty and realize that control is meaningless against the gravity of the heart. He felt her absence. He felt her patience. He felt her integrity. He felt her love, restrained but unwavering, unyielding but respectful, quiet but undeniable. And in feeling, he understood what he had been missing all along. Love without feeling is empty. Power without connection is hollow. Control without trust is meaningless. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. It happened in glances that lingered longer than before, in shared silences that no longer carried fear, in the subtle acknowledgement of presence, of need, of dependence, and of courage. And she remained calm, honest, patient. She loved him quietly, but she demanded nothing beyond honesty. She refused to beg. She refused to compromise herself. And through that, she reshaped him. She had not given him love. She had given him the ability to recognize it within himself. And that was far more powerful, because a man who feels cannot ignore. A man who feels cannot retreat. A man who feels cannot hide behind walls, rules, or fear. And now he was feeling fully, dangerously, honestly. For the first time, he understood what it meant to be alive in a way no empire, no control, no power could ever teach him. She didn't teach him how to love her. She taught him how to feel. And in learning that, he realized that some lessons cannot be undone. Some truths cannot be forgotten. And some hearts, once awakened, refuse to remain silent ever again. In the quiet of the house, in the tension of the distance that had once threatened to destroy them, in the fragile recognition of two hearts learning to exist in the same space, love had arrived. But it arrived differently now. Not as possession, not as expectation, not as a fairy tale promise, but as a force that was alive, patient, and undeniable. A force that had waited in silence and had finally been felt. And so, in the quiet that followed months of restraint, fear, and unspoken longing, the story reached its final, fragile turning point. The house was no longer empty, not because the walls had changed, but because they had changed inside it. She had stayed, yes, but she stayed on terms that honored her strength, her patience, her integrity, and he stayed too, in a way he never had before, not by duty, not by control, not by fear, but by choice. Some people don't fear love because it is weak. They fear love because it is real, because real love strips away pretense. It exposes every vulnerability. It asks you to step into the unknown and accept it anyway. It is not comfortable, not safe, and certainly not predictable. It is raw. It is frightening. It is magnificent. He had spent his life building walls to protect himself from it. And yet, in losing her, almost losing her, he discovered that the power of love lies not in possession, not in control, but in surrender. She had taught him that. through honesty, through calm, through love given quietly, without demand, without compromise, healing over possession, choice over control, growth over fear. These were the lessons that lingered long after the last misunderstanding had been cleared, long after silence had been broken, long after fear had been faced. And they shaped the lives of both of them, not into perfection, but into something far more enduring, understanding. They had survived their own walls, their own doubts, their own fears. And in that survival, they found something neither had expected but both had longed for, a partnership rooted not in circumstance, not in obligation, but in mutual respect, trust, and the courage to feel. The story doesn't end with fireworks. It doesn't end with instant resolution. It doesn't end in a fairy tale fantasy where everything is simple. It ends in truth. The truth that love, in its quietest, most restrained form, can heal even hearts hardened by control and fear. And in that truth, the greatest questions remain. Will you recognize love when it demands courage instead of comfort? Will you step forward when honesty challenges your pride? Can you allow someone to teach you how to feel without trying to control the lesson? Because some stories do not offer easy resolutions. They offer growth. They offer awareness. They offer a chance to choose love over fear, presence over absence, and connection over control. And that is the final, enduring lesson. Love is not about possession. It is about presence. Love is not about control. It is about choice. And love is not about surrendering yourself. It is about discovering how strong you can truly be when you allow yourself to feel. So, ask yourself, have you ever loved someone quietly, without expectation, and let them teach you how to feel? Have you ever feared love, not because it was weak, but because it was real? And if you had the chance to reclaim it, would you step forward? Or wait until it was almost too late? Because sometimes, the moments that matter most are those we are too afraid to reach for. And sometimes the hearts we almost lose are the ones that teach us how to truly live. And now, as their story lingers in the quiet spaces of the house, in the unspoken glances and restrained touches that mark the beginning of something new, the questions remain. Questions that do not have easy answers, but are worth pondering. Should she have stayed, or was walking away? The preparation, the silent readiness to leave, the truest form of love. Because sometimes love isn't about proximity. Sometimes love is about boundaries. Sometimes love is proven not by clinging, but by the courage to step back when the heart requires it. Was he cruel, or was he merely afraid? Afraid of feeling too much, too deeply, too quickly. Afraid of attachment, of vulnerability, of a world he had spent a lifetime trying to control. Afraid of letting someone into the part of himself he had protected at all costs. Have you ever loved someone in silence? Loved them quietly, patiently, with restraint? Loved them without expectation, without demand, without pleading? Loved them in a way that gave them space, even as your own heart ached. These are the moments that shape us, the silent, restrained, almost invisible acts of love that remain unseen by the world, but burn brightly in memory. And now, as you reflect on their story, ask yourself, would you have the courage to wait, quietly, for someone to meet you halfway? Would you have the strength to walk away, even from someone you loved deeply, if it meant honoring yourself? Would you risk your own heart on a love that demands honesty, patience, and vulnerability? Because the answers are not simple. They are layered. They are fragile, dangerous, and profoundly human. And that is why we tell these stories, so we can feel them, reflect on them, and perhaps recognize a part of ourselves in the quiet bravery of hearts that dare to love, even when it is frightening, even when it is restrained, even when the outcome is uncertain. So, leave your thoughts. Share your reflections. Tell us, should she have stayed, or was walking away the truest act of love? Was he cruel, or was he simply afraid? Have you ever loved someone in silence and waited for them to see you as you saw them? Because in these questions, the story continues. Not just theirs, but ours. And sometimes, the most powerful moments of love are the ones that remain unspoken, waiting for us to finally understand them. If this story gave you chills, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories.